Felicity Gerry QC, is coming at the same generic problem, global dislocation, from a somewhat different vantage point. Felicity, I don't know, I'm sure you're unique in many ways, but are you unique in being a practicing member of the London Bar and a practicing member of the Darwin Bar?
Yeah.
10 weeks, as I understand it, in London every year, and the rest of the time practicing in Darwin. She's been recognised in Legal 500 as a fearless and effective advocate, tenacious in court, and by other experts as a vastly experienced advocate noted for her experience in serious sexual cases, homicides and frauds. She's prosecuted and defended numerous cases involving minor, serious, complex crime, often with an international element, and she was, for those of you who religiously watch Foreign Correspondent, fascinatingly portrayed. I mean, she was not portrayed. She was a fascinating contributor to a tragic and continuing case, the case of the Filipina who was trafficked with drugs on her and was slated to be executed with the Bali 9. She was reprieved at that time. She's still in jail, and Felicity is working on that, many other cases similar to those. She also is an academic, and her research deals with the fields of human trafficking, gender equality, evidence, and female genital mutilation. And I've not met her before, but after listening to her for 5 minutes, she says she's going to talk about all of this, and I have no doubt that she'll be capable of doing that.
Thank you. I don't know about all of it, but I'll pick two. The wicked problem, it seems to me, for history is the treatment of women. And that wicked problem finds itself in the topic this evening. I'm going to start with human trafficking and the story of Mary Jane Veloso, just for you to realise how wicked the problem is, and then move on to the topic of justice in the age of global dislocation, but perhaps calling it for the moment justice in the age of global movement. Starting with human trafficking, my work in London involved being a criminal barrister at the time, but I became interested in what happens if your client has committed a crime but they're under coercion or they've acted as a victim of human trafficking. And if you pause for a moment, we think about ISIS and we think about the treatment of women by ISIS and the slavery that women are placed in by ISIS. And we think of our own history as women. There are moments when you can think about not being terribly far apart. And if we are going to think that particular terrorist organisations are as frightening as they are, then we do have to think about how frightening we are. So I started to research what should a lawyer do if their client is a victim of human trafficking. And it was a particularly difficult problem, solved eventually by the Court of Appeal, who said it's all an abusive process, you mustn't prosecute these people at all, providing there's credible evidence that they are human trafficked victims. The reason the Court of Appeal could do that was because we had a Human Rights Act that insists on us referring to the European Convention on Human Rights. We now have some stupid debate in England about exiting the Europe and having our own Bill of Rights, will no doubt be incredibly colonial and anti-women probably, but there we go. That's for a platform in England, I think. So the research that I did was, well, hang on a minute, Court of Appeal, very good. Abusive process, let's argue that for our client. We had a client, didn't work. And my client, as well as the research that I was doing, she went to prison for 7 years, and it was all terribly difficult. So I came to Australia. That's a whole long story. I'll tell you another time. And I started to work at Charles Darwin University as well as being a barrister. And as an academic, you really have to have a topic that you research. And I thought, well, what about human trafficking? What about women in the justice system? What about the visibility of women in the justice system? There's not many of me, Women Queen's Council. I'm not an alumni of somewhere particularly special, so I can't join the gentlemen in that. I was born in East London, and it was a bloody hard task to get to where I am now. And if it's difficult for me, how difficult is it for a woman like Mary Jane Veloso in abject poverty who has no other choice than to travel where she did? So I looked at the law on human trafficking in England, which by this time had brought about the Modern Slavery Act, which has a complete defence that you can raise if your client has committed a crime, certain crimes, and you can raise the defence of human trafficking, then they raise that complete defence. Hopefully they're not prosecuted at all. All of this comes from international obligations that have been implemented in Europe and then in England and Wales. I looked at the Indonesian law, because in Darwin we're closer to Indonesia than we are to Melbourne. I looked at the Philippines law, and various other places. The Indonesian law is really, really interesting. It has a specific law issued by the Office for the Empowerment of Women and Girls in Indonesia that says that victims of human trafficking who commit crime, victim has a particular definition, will be protected, will not be prosecuted. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but similar to the Modern Slavery Act. They've had it since 2007. England and Wales brought it in 2015. The Philippines had one in 2003, updated in 2012. These countries know they have a human trafficking problem. Australia does not have such a law. It has a policy about protecting human traffic victims. Quite how they're going to find them, how you're going to find them, I don't quite know. So having done this research, I got an email that said, "Save Mary Jane, sign our petition." And I sat in a little room in Darwin and thought, well, I've got a separation of powers, that's political, I don't know if I'm going to sign a petition. I'm a lawyer, I get very hung up about petitions, so I might not sign it, what do I do? Plus I'll get a load of spam. So I didn't sign it, but I emailed, I said, I think I can help you. And those of you who've watched Foreign Correspondent know the rest, because I did help the Philippines lawyers. I'm not her lawyer, I'm someone who's helped the Philippine lawyers. And I was in Jakarta a week or so ago speaking at a forum in the University of Indonesia, and I also had an opportunity of speaking to a government minister over there. But the way that you effectively help your client is to use what are called human trafficking referral mechanisms. What that really means is you tell the authorities that your client is a victim, and the authorities are supposed to investigate that and discover whether there's credible evidence, and if there is, not to prosecute at all, or not to punish if it's sufficiently serious for there to be a prosecution, not to punish in the same way. Australia doesn't have those provisions. Of course, the human trafficking referral mechanism in Australia is filling in a form. You like forms. I'm not sure how many victims of human trafficking are actually going to be in a position to fill in a form, but there we go. So the consequence was that the Philippine lawyers used the human trafficking referral mechanisms, her recruiters were identified, they're currently on trial. It became perfectly plain that there was evidence that she was a victim of human trafficking when she took drugs across the border. And she was reprieved 30 minutes before she was due to be shot. She'd said goodbye to her children and her mum. I'd gone to bed, and ironically my daughter was with me, not knowing if my client would be there in the morning. And I've never had a client shot, so it was a really emotional experience. You have a connection of mums across the world. I've never met her. I daren't go and say, "Hello, I'm your lawyer," because it ratchets up the issue. I only provide whatever assistance I can provide. And she lived, but she's still in prison. The trial of her recruiters goes on. And you stop to think about the real issue, which is, across the world, we lock up women in prison, in detention, who are victims of abuse, violence, coercion, abuse of vulnerability, deceived, manipulated, all of the definitions within the human trafficking protocol, all of those real life issues that women suffer. My dream project is to go in every prison and interview the women who are in there. Most of them should not be in there. Certainly in detention, the women and children should not be in there. And the only reason they are in there is, as Julian says, that we have this terrible prejudice. One is sexism, the other is racism. I find here, I'm a little bit Indian, I find here I hang on to it, because you don't want to listen to English people anyway. You've been listening to them in the past, and who wants to listen to the English? Anyway, who wants to listen to a girl from Dagenham? You just want to tell me a funny joke about myself and the chip fork in the steering wheel, or whatever it is. So I hang on to the fact that I'm a little bit brown. And you can't help but think most of these problems are not just about women, but you start to think about how many brown women are we looking up that have come across the border with drugs up their bum. And I'm not sure how many of us would choose to put drugs up our bum. And if we're not choosing, then it's highly likely they're victims of human trafficking. So just think about those women travelling, moving, an age of global movement across borders, who are moving in situations of abuse, of vulnerability in particular. Those women who sit in detention centres, as Julian was speaking about, who sit in prison like Mary Jane Veloso. How much do you know about the women in prison in Australia, in a country where there is no law to protect human trafficking victims? There's laws to prosecute the traffickers, of course, but no mandatory protection for human trafficked victims. Lots of shaming around women as well. If women do commit a crime, lots of shaming. Next time you pick up a newspaper, you look at the way a woman's case is reported differently from a man's. Which brings me to female genital mutilation, which is an area in which I hope I never get another brief, because if I do, it means a child has been cut. And most people don't know a lot about female genital mutilation, and I'm not going to bang on about it all evening. I have had one audience, I got them all to chant vagina, but I'll let you off tonight. I wrote a book called The Sexual Offences Handbook in 2010 with a colleague, because as a woman at the bar, first of all, you get given family law, and you don't want to do that because it's miserable, because there's an identifiable enemy, it's him or her. Then you get given the sexual offences, so I was determined to be the best at sexual offences and write the book on it. And we had a long debate about including a chapter on FGM, and eventually we did, because some forms of FGM are designed to take away a woman's sexual pleasure. And I contacted the English equivalent of the DPP and said, well, we've got sexual offences prevention orders, why don't we use them in the context of FGM? Oh, they said, oh no, they don't apply. I said, well, I think they could do, or at least you could propose an amendment. I'm sure the government would listen to you. No, don't apply. There was a long pause, we put it in the book. And then I was invited by the very same Crown Prosecution Service, would you come and train all our lawyers on FGM? So I forgave them, and I did. And there was a prosecution, but it failed, and there's been one in Sydney since. But that was in 2010. So for 6 years, I've been involved in campaigns in England and Australia to raise awareness in relation to FGM. Often what you get is the same reaction. Oh, Muslims. We've recently added the figures for Indonesia. The estimated numbers of women and children at risk of female genital mutilation was running for about 10 years at about 140 million women and girls. Adding in Indonesia added in another 60 million, so we're now on an estimated data of 200 million women and girls, different types and levels of female genital mutilation. The problem then is when you're trying to deal with it as a women's health issue, because it has terrible health consequences, the reaction is extremely discriminatory. Oh, that's what they do. That's what those African people do. That's what those Muslim people do. But we really have to challenge ourselves about that, because it's really important in the context of global movement. You Australians love to travel. I haven't met one yet that hasn't. I went from -5 to +35. I thought I was amazing. It was one journey. You've been everywhere. You like going everywhere. And what I don't understand is why you don't like everybody coming in. And what was really weird was you let my husband in really easily. It took me ages to get admitted as a lawyer. So that was really weird too. It's like you'll dish out a 457 visa to some bloke that can build a building. But you're a bit peculiar about some woman that can argue the law. But there we go. I got there in the end. The people that I've seen in the detention centre in Darwin had PhDs. They were a bit cleverer than me, and I didn't speak Farsi either, and they spoke English. So you start to think, hang on a minute, why am I here? They really let them in and I'll go, you know. So I started to look at how can we tackle female genital mutilation in a really non-discriminatory way. And you start to discover that 40 years ago there was some research around intercision with Indigenous people that seems to have been left behind because they've learned to educate their girls in extremely difficult circumstances and hopefully not to have sex until they're much older, so no need for intercision there. So we can learn a great deal from Aboriginal people despite all the appalling atrocities that they've suffered. And the priority that they give and the value that they give to their women. Secondly, we have a significant problem with young white girls having labiaplasty to make their vaginas look like the sort of vaginas their boyfriends see in pornography on the internet. So you start to think, well, hang on a minute, this isn't just what they do, it's a problem, a cultural problem that we need to deal with as a women's health issue. And I went for something called a well woman check. I got old enough to have one. I didn't go for ages because I didn't want to be old enough to have one. And they asked me loads of questions about my sex life and my husband's sex life. That was a bit weird. So they said, you know, do you take it up the bum? Do you take it in the mouth? Do you do all these things? You have to answer these questions. You have to think about a few of them. Has your husband had an affair? Have you? Really, actually, very important health questions. And at the end, I said, but you haven't asked me anything about FGM. Which my daughter afterwards said, oh, typical of you, Mum. And I said, yeah, it is typical of me because you have to raise awareness about it. And if you asked every mum, have you had FGM, have you got a daughter, would you cut your daughter, as a tick box on a health visitor form or a well woman check, what's harm in that? You're not discriminating against anybody. Think of all the cultural things we could have discovered if we treated, for example, underage sex, or for example, underage sex with priests, that we could have dealt with. Sorry, for those of you religious in the room, I'm not even going to go there again, but you can start to think of our own cultural history in relation to women in a very different way. The first prosecution for marital servitude in England was this year, because they created an offence of servitude. And then, oh my goodness, somebody argued, how can you possibly apply that to marriage? Well, you have been for centuries, but there's only one conviction. Otherwise, everybody's getting away with it. That's just what they do. You can see how there's so many nonsenses about discrimination and the sorts of issues that we have to tackle. So that's my 5-minute warning. I can speak for England, but I'm just going to go back to Julian's analogy. And I love what Julian said, but I just want to pick you up on one thing. Well, I'm going to tell it in two ways. The first is it reminded me immediately of Richard Pryor. That I don't know if any of you remember the comedian Richard Pryor. When he hears a smash in the living room, goes in the living room, so who broke that? Huh? Who broke that? I'm going to tell you, okay? And that look from the child who's not going to tell you at all what happened reminded me of Richard Pryor. Those of you who like it, you'll find it on the internet. He delivers it far better than I. But the other part is that actually real justice is mum goes in there, sweeps up the vase and doesn't punish anybody because she's never going to know who did it. And what's the point of sending him to bed without any supper? Because he's going to cry anyway. And you can say, well, never mind, dear, don't break mummy's vase again. It's only a thing. So I get why you gave the example. I really do. But in relation to women in prison and children in detention and children in prison, the massive problems with youth justice here and locking up children, criminalising whole generations of children, the answer is just don't punish them for breaking the vase. Don't punish them for taking drugs across the border. Don't prosecute in the first place. We have to change. And the way we have to change is to stop locking people up. It's really, really simple. It doesn't do any good. At most, it keeps people off the streets who are largely victims of abuse. So really, they could do with being assisted to have proper health treatment. And then how long do you keep them off the streets for before they're utterly hopeless? It really is utterly pointless. Of course, there are some people who are dangerous and have issues, but something like 2 to 9% of prisoners are women. It's exceptional to have a woman in court anyway. Most men in prison have probably got a traumatic brain injury from pissing it up the wall and beating each other up for years. So they're probably ill with mental health problems. Most women in prison have got multiple issues. Most children in prison simply have been punished with no supper for breaking a vase. Sorry, I can't resist it. But But I think the culture that needs to change, and I like coming to Victoria because you at least do have some form of human rights charter. I struggle in Darwin. There aren't any human rights in Darwin. There is one, actually. I found it. It's section 138(3) of an evidence provision that relies on the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. So I thought it was amazing. I found one human right in the Northern Territory. So I like coming here. If you've got human rights, just use them. Use them. It's got to be a balanced and proportionate response. Human rights is all about, actually, everybody moving a little bit into the middle. It might make us all a little bit boring. It may even make us a little bit browner over time, like me, because I had a racy great-grandmother, but that's another story. But that's what human rights to me really mean. If we're all going to be equal in some way and have equality, whatever adjustments we need for that to be properly achieved, then that's what we need to do, is change. We have to change. We have to demonstrate it's better to live in Australia than it is to go and live in Syria with ISIS. For women not to choose to go and live with ISIS because it has a perception of being better than living in England. That's a problem that England has, and no doubt Australia has and will have. I'll leave you with this, and it's slightly off topic, but it's the one I like to say the most because I think it's quite challenging. If a 15-year-old child is groomed on the internet for sex, we call them a victim. If a 15-year-old child is groomed on the internet for terrorism, we call them a defendant. It's really, really weird. So I think I'll leave you with, it's us that has to change. In order to achieve justice, we have to treat dislocation as movement and let everybody move. For me, I did it. I'm still here. I feel like saying I'm still here, you bastards, like Papillon, because that always reminds me of Nauru. But thank you for listening. Lots for you to talk about. I think the message really is, if you just think how bad our history has been, particularly towards women and children, it doesn't mean these phenomena are new. There have been crises in history for generations. We chopped off heads of states. Whole families have died. We've had revolutions and conflict for centuries. Maybe the answer is to have more women in conflict resolution on the international stage, but that's perhaps another speech. So that's me. I think I've run over time like everyone else. That seems to be what I'm supposed to do. At least there's a proportion of Victoria that's going to leave this room and alter. So thank you very much.